Hello, Steve.
Hello, David. Welcome to Fundamental Freedoms. I'm Steve Burgess. I'm broadcasting from my home in Utah.
And I'm David Sabine. I'm broadcasting from my home in London, Ontario. You can check us out at fundamentalfreedoms.org, also at Rumble and Facebook and YouTube, also at locals.com. If you want to join our community there, that would be great.
So, Fundamental Freedoms, we believe that good society is based on good conversation. It's okay to come to a conversation not prepared to do battle. It's okay to change your mind, and it's okay to have a lot of respect, even for those that we disagree with. So, with that, David?
Steve and I have agreed amongst ourselves to, in our conversations, we abide by two general rules. One is that we avoid undefined they statements. If we use the word they, we try to be specific about who we're talking about. And undefined we statements. We don't, neither of us claim to be speaking on behalf of any group or affiliation. I'm here as an individual. I believe Steve is as well, and our guests when they join us. Tonight we have a wonderful guest. I was very happy to discover that well, first of all, I was happy to discover that we have a Libertarian Party in Canada. I learned of the party about a year and a half ago. And then I discovered recently that the new leader of the Libertarian Party of Canada is here in my riding in London, Ontario, and I reached out to him. He was gracious enough to take time away from his campaign activities. As you know, or if you don't know, Canada is in a federal election right now. And so we have tonight a wonderful guest named Jacques Boudreau, and I'd like to bring him on screen. Steve, did I miss anything?
No, I think that sounds good. I'm excited to have a conversation with Jacques.
Great. So, Jacques, it's so nice to see you. Thank you for being with us. I would like if you just take a couple of minutes and tell us about your journey and what brings you to what you're doing and how it is that you've joined us here tonight.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. Well, in terms of journey, I'm assuming you mean as leader. So I would say that until about 20 years ago, I would have described myself as a quintessential Canadian. That is, middle of the road, not very happy with any sort of extreme position. Like many Canadians, I would have moved my vote around depending on different circumstances. But then I was subscribing to an investment newsletter, and one time they had a link to an article that appeared on Mises.org. I couldn't tell you what the article was, but what I do remember is reading it and thinking, my goodness, this is a point of view that I had never heard of before. And on top of that, it made a lot more sense than the norm. And starting on that day, I have gone to the Mises.org website to read the one or two, sometimes more, articles that are posted. And what happened is that over the years, I essentially came to a point where a lot of my previously held beliefs I could no longer abide by, and I became a libertarian. So, the last one to crumble in a way was public health care. That took a while. It was the last one to go, but I no longer think it's the best way to go forward. And eventually that led to, in 2015, to run in the federal election. I then ran in the 2018 provincial election under the Ontario Libertarian Party banner, ran again in the federal election in 2019, and then I was going to put my name up to be deputy leader at our convention in Edmonton on August the 14th and 15th, but then Tim Moen, our past leader, decided that he had made, it was time for him to to look after his family. He had made a number of sacrifices, and so that became open, and I was getting some encouragement, shall we say, on a lot of people, on the part of a lot of people to run, which I did. And then on the 15th, I became leader. So that's my journey in a nutshell.
Thank you. Thank you, Jacques. We've invited Jacques tonight to help us understand some of the election issues. And I hope that we'll bring Jacques back in the future to talk about the Libertarian Party in more depth, its history, its future. But as we're in an election, I would really like to hear a Libertarian perspective about the hot button issues. And one of the ways to discover those hot button issues is to look to the, there's a tool that, a survey tool that is commissioned each election by CBC. Of course, it's taxpayer funded, and it's a series of questions that highlight the election issues of the day. And I'd like to step through those questions. We may move through them slow, some fast. Is there anything more to add, or can we just jump in? What do you think, guys?
No, I've got a million questions for Jacques, but maybe they'll come up as we go through some of these issues. So that's great.
All right. So the first question of the survey. There we go. I'll bring it up on screen. Some provinces pay more than their fair share to support the rest of the country. And then we'll have to decide as a trio if we're going to strongly agree or disagree with this. Over to you first, I think, Jacques.
Well, I would strongly agree, if only because it's actually part of our platform that equalization payment would cease completely. Like, we are the belief that many provinces are not doing well because of economic policies that are terrible, and we really ought not to encourage that by kind of making up the gap by transferring money from provinces that have either better economic policies or have been more fortunate. But you should be able to, or you should rather, deal with the consequences of your economic policies.
So Jacques, if Alberta is chock full of oil and oil prices are doing well, and the potato economy is not nearly as good, shouldn't money be taken from that part of Canada, from Albertans, and transferred to PEI so that they can enjoy the same quality of life?
No, and it's for people, it's for the people to decide if they want to have a better quality of life, assuming, of course, that one would claim that it's better in Alberta. If you think that that's the case, then move. It's as simple as that. But I would also bring up two of my favorite examples, Hong Kong and Singapore. You know, two very small states with basically no natural resources to speak of. And when you look at the ranking of countries in terms of wealth, invariably they're in the top 5, year after year after year. So you don't need oil, you don't need natural resources to necessarily do well.
Interesting. Mm-hmm. So I'm hearing strongly agree.
Well, I think I have a little bit of problem with the premise of the question, the word fair for one thing, but yeah, I mean, and I would agree with Jacques, get rid of the transfer payments altogether, but yeah.
I do find it interesting that the equalization concept is challenged, and I think it's being challenged in court, or is it the equation that is being challenged in court?
Well, I'm not sure, but I know that the so-called equation is unfathomably complex, and yeah, it's very, very difficult to explain it to anybody, yeah, which, to me raises a red flag immediately.
Shall
Yeah,
we move on? Oh, carry on, Steve. Go ahead.
well, the whole idea of trying to equalize a country the size of Canada. I live in the U.S., and so we're about 10 times the population roughly. But one of my favorite economists talks about the idea of like, what are the chances that you could go into a room, you could order sandwiches successfully for 10 people, and please every one of those 10 people, asking them or getting their input or not getting their input, doing the same sandwich for everybody, randomizing it. You would have such a difficult time pleasing 10 people, and then you start talking about pleasing a million people or 30 million people, and how do you, how do you, the word equal, the word fair, the idea of quality of life. I think that's a great point. Maybe I would far prefer to live on, $30,000 a year and live in PEI than I would live on $100,000 in Alberta, because that's my choice and my preference. I think it's folly to try and equalize. That sounds draconian to me. We don't have, I guess we have similar things that happen in the United States, but it's not as overt as saying we're going to equalize the states and transfer money from one to the other. Although I guess that's the net effect of heavy federal taxation and then a lot of, infrastructure and spending in the various states. But anyway,
Transferism.
Yeah.
The word fair here, and the nature of this question makes me wonder if another question could be asked, and that is, do we believe that each province is fairly representing their domestic product in light of the current equation that takes, or the calculations that take place regarding equalization? Like, for example, is one province incented to either underreport or subsidize certain areas of their economy, undercharge for the provincial services, and claim that they're running in deficit, and therefore they need injections from other provinces? I think it's, Jacques, I've never heard someone say so bluntly, just stop the whole thing. Equalization payments stop. And so that's, you're saying, is a fundamental part of the Libertarian Party platform, correct?
Yeah, that's part of our platform.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm eager to move on, if both of you are.
Yep. Yeah.
Next question says, all Canadians should have access to government-funded prescription drugs.
Well, again, the way these questions are asked, well, I would strongly disagree. I don't think that the government should have anything to do with this. This should be part of your private healthcare coverage with your insurer. But let me digress for a minute and go on to one of my my pet peeve, if you wish. Canada, at the federal and provincial level combined, has a $2.7 trillion unfunded liability problem. I'm not going to bore you with the details. To simplify it, an unfunded liability simply means that the value of the services that have been promised to you by the government in the future exceed the value of the taxes that will be collected to pay for those services. Okay, in other words, there will not be enough money in the future at the tune of about $2.7 trillion. So even if I were to say, oh yes, all Canadians should have access to government-funded prescription drugs, since that is not part of the current set of promises and that we cannot pay in full the current set of promises, adding prescription drugs is a non-starter from a fiscal point of view.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So an unfunded liability would be, I have a mortgage, so that is and I have a salary, so that is a funded liability, let's say.
Yeah.
But what you're saying is our governments over the past decades have made promises that for which we have no revenue to pay for those liabilities. And this question here isn't, should Canadians have access to some government-funded prescription drugs? So are there any prescription drugs that you do think could be paid for by a single payer system?
I don't really see a case for that.
So there's no case. Is there a case to be made, for example, for? And I don't know that this is actually true, but one of the arguments is that the Canadians do a better. We have better behavior around preventative medicine, let's say, better than in the United States, they say, or it is said. Because we have access to doctors without a fee, we have access to some prescription drugs that don't hurt our pocketbook, that we're being a little more proactive, and then we're not showing up in dire straits at the end of the line when procedures are very expensive. Does that argument make any sense? Is there a case to be made for that?
So if we take a holistic view, a full picture view of this, the argument that you bring is probably valid. Now the question to ask is at what cost? And this is where, we could go on about, unintended consequences, excessive usage because somebody else pays for it. Like on balance, I think if you, again, look at the full picture, you would create more harm than good. And I stress that I don't disagree with the good element that you described, but there's a cost. And this is something that gets ignored all the time. I mean, it's astonishing to me how one-sided or how decisions are made on one-sided arguments as opposed to looking at the whole picture.
So I could provide an interesting insight. I think I've spent about half of my life now in Canada growing up, and about half of my life mostly as an adult in the United States. And I remember within the first year or two of moving down here that I got in a situation where I had to decide whether I was going to go into the emergency room or not. Didn't have a severed limb or anything, but I was feeling pretty ill and thought, do I wait and go in the morning when it's going to be less expensive? I could just go and see a local doctor and pay a copay rather than going to the ER and having a much higher copay on my private insurance. And I remember lying in bed that night and just pining for universal health care and thinking, I've moved to this barbarous country where I have to make an economic decision about my physical health. And it's the worst feeling in the world. I can't believe people live like this. I grew up, if I get a sniffle, I go to the doctor, and nobody's asking me for money. I just show them my Saskatchewan health card and I get health care. And so fast forward 25 years, Monday night, my son had an asthma attack, and my wife said, I think we need to get him into the Instacare, and there was about 10 minutes left. We could go, other than that, it's the emergency room. We got in there. They stress tested him. His oxygen went way down and said, you better head into the emergency room. And so I found myself again in the emergency room, this time with my son, and thinking some of the same things. The doctor came in and said, he's got this low-grade fever. I think we should get him some Tylenol. And I said, is it rude for me to mention my wife's got an ibuprofen in her purse? It probably costs us 30 cents. Your Tylenol is going to be $70. can we just give him, and he's like, yeah, if you want to give him, yeah, that's fine. And so we just give him the Tylenol out of the purse. And so, and as I think about that, it's not a comfortable position. I don't like being in that position and having to make those healthcare choices. But in order, as I've spent time here, in order for me to have the luxury of just not worrying about that at all, I have to force then everyone else in the country essentially to be a part of that system, because it doesn't work if only, insurance companies do not do that kind of adverse selection where they say, anybody who would like free health care, come and get it. Anybody, and anybody who doesn't want it, don't, or whatever. And like universal health care only works if it's universal. And then my health care, in order to have that warm, fuzzy feeling of free, I'm now forcing everyone else to do the same thing. And I as much as it's uncomfortable at those moments in the emergency room, I still like the idea of having choice, because ultimately I could just walk out of the emergency room too and say, you know what, we'll go home and take our chances and go to the doctor in the morning. But sorry, I went on a little wild goose chase there for a minute, but I don't know, that's been my experience. I guess I've gotten used to it, and I feel like, having experienced both, I'd still rather have the choice to manage that.
I've also lived in both countries. I was in Arizona for 2.5 years, and as a student of Arizona State University, I was able to subscribe to a university negotiated healthcare insurance provider, and my payment, I think, was about $100 a month, and just about everything was covered if I went to a hospital in the region. So if I traveled out to California or New Mexico, I might be at risk of paying out of pocket for some things. But if I was in the region, then I was covered. And I have to admit, the facilities were great. The services were fantastic. I did have occasion to need the services. So it changed my perspective, certainly, about the Canadian system. Nowadays, I think about the Canadian system as it seems to me a single-payer system for some services, and some of those services are government-run, while others of those services are run by private organizations. And we have this interesting blend. I worry that the conversation gets polarized about healthcare. Right now in the election, people are trying to lambaste the conservative leader because he had mentioned he would be open to the possibility of some private services in the system. But we already have private services in the system, like my dentist is a private provider, chiropractors and all sorts of things. So, sorry, I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but so interrupt me.
But David, I was going to say that in Canada, 55% of healthcare dollars are spent on private companies.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and this is part of the problem. I'm really frustrated in Canada because we don't have transparency about the costs. Like, we have no idea what the taxpayers are paying to various providers for those services. I'm sure, well, the argument might be that the province of Ontario is so massive that it can negotiate for low prices, but I'm leery about that. I think there's a lot of potential overpricing and potential corruption regarding lobbying and so forth. And it's all invisible to the taxpayer. Sorry to cut you off, but Jacques, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, you mentioned dentists, but, chiropractors, there's a whole slew of other health providers that
physiotherapists, massage therapists,
it's all done
doulas.
Mm-hmm. It adds up to 55% of the total amount.
Yeah.
But I mean, you know, I think it's called the Commonwealth Institute, and I think it's US based. Just maybe a month ago, released a study of healthcare in 11 Western countries, and the US ranked last and Canada second last. So, you know, I don't have a lot of time for people who, you know, just love the system. I mean, they any talk about changing it is met with complete disapproval. It's almost like they're going around yelling, "We're number 10, we're number 10," and they're happy with it. It doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, there are all, okay, so maybe the US is not what we, I mean, if they rank below, you know, we ought to look somewhere else.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if you knew, but something like 12 years ago, the Dutch went to, except for long-term care, went completely private. They don't even have a public element anymore. What the government does is it does provide subsidies to people who cannot pay for their insurance premium. And last I looked, on something like 15 different measures, they did better than Canada on about 10 of them, right? So on 2/3, they beat us. Well, it seems to be that any reasonable person would look at this and say that seems to be the ticket to improve our ranking, not make it worse.
Or at
But
least let's have the conversation about it. Let's be
yeah,
open to
but the
having the
problem is that we
conversation.
can't even have the conversation.
Yeah,
You
it's so
get shouted
polarizing.
down immediately.
Yeah. Yeah, you get, you know, O'Toole is being cast as some sort of, you know, far right heathen that wants to take away universal health care. Well, actually, that's not at all what he said. He's open to having a conversation about some private options, and anyway, transparency in the system would be great. Oh yeah, carry on.
So let me bring my actuarial hat into this again, because no, this is not on the radar of any of my opponents, and same thing at the provincial level. But in 2014, one of my actuarial colleagues, and this was sponsored by the Canadian Institute of Actuaries, did a study that showed that absent of any mitigating, you know, efforts to change things, that 25 years out, right? So that would bring us to about 2040. 103% of the average province budget would have to be spent on healthcare. Now stop and think about this for a minute. 103%. That means for people who love the government to be involved in education and building roads and all, servicing the debt, right? All of this is gone, right? Every single dollar that you're taking in would have to go and pay for healthcare. So we have an enormous problem facing us, and nobody's talking about it. I mean, to me, it's borderline criminal. Because again, you're making promises to people that cannot be delivered on.
What would you say to the people who would argue that money has to be spent no matter what, because the healthcare needs are growing, and so therefore that amount of budget is required? Is it not sensible to funnel that budget through a single payer?
Okay, all I'm saying is, though, is then we're not going to have not that I would be opposed to it, but we wouldn't have a publicly funded education system, as an example, and we'd have to default on the debt because there'd be no money to pay the interest.
Or raise all the taxes, of course, like create that income somehow.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I think what I'm hearing from you is that you're raising the issue that this massive spend is necessary in the future, and we're not even talking about it. Like, we're not even open to having conversation about options, it seems.
Yeah, and this is all driven by the demographics. I mean, I could show you graphs of what it looks like, as the baby boomers are making their way through through time, right? I mean, in 1960, you had a beautiful pyramid, very, very few people at the top, huge amount of kids at the bottom.
Yeah.
And then again, I could show you graphs where that bulge is making its way, and now it doesn't look like a pyramid anymore. It looks like a boa that's eaten something rather large, because you got more people in the middle. And of course, when they reach, the 70s and their 80s and 90s, that's when the system is going to collapse.
Yeah. This has been a good discussion. We're on question number 2. Should we move on?
Let's do it.
All right. All Canadians should have access to government-funded prescription drugs. I think the answer was strongly disagree.
Yeah.
Okay, now we're going to move to next question. Canada's laws against hate speech place too many limits on freedom of expression. This might be a quick answer.
I strongly agree.
I strongly
100%.
agree. Yeah. Is there anything we want to say about this? I mean, the argument always is that, well, what do we do about the crazy people that just want to incite hatred and violence, and, shouldn't they be stopped somehow?
The people who go on about wanting more laws or whatever clearly don't believe that what's in the criminal code already does the job. Now, and my point would simply be, if you don't think it does the job, then change the law. But adding more, human rights tribunal, more censorship or whatever, I mean, we have something in place already, right? I mean, it's already illegal in this country to incite hatred or violence against other people. That seems to be good enough for me, because that's all we need.
And if that were enforced, like, maybe it's not enforced as strongly or as broadly as some people would like. Is that a fair statement? Could it be enforced more to capture more of it?
It's, to me, that's the implication of people who want more laws, is that they certainly don't think that it's being used enough. But then let's just enforce the law.
What I worry about at this point,
I have no problems. I mean, I don't think it is a violation of the non-aggression principle to incite violence against innocent people. So I'm all in favor of the law as it stands right now.
But hate crime legislation, you're crossing the line. You've stopped policing action, and now you're trying to police thought. Essentially, you're saying, what you were thinking or what your intent was when you committed a crime is now some important part or element of that crime as far as the law goes. I mean, I think it's crazy. It's ridiculous. I just watched Minority Report with Tom Cruise, and are we? Because that's the next logical step, right? You have, this is the punishment, this is the law against doing this action, and the law is more stringent, and your punishment is stronger if you did that or broke that law with this intent in your mind. And why not take the next logical step to, we've determined that you have the intent to commit that crime, so we might as well just prosecute you right now before you commit it.
Well, that is, in fact, what was written in Bill C-36, which thankfully never saw the light of day, except, the moment after Parliament closed, this document was put on the floor of the House of Commons, or on the table in the House, I don't know the terminology, but Bill C-36 did in fact allow a person to be prosecuted if someone else thought they were going to be harmed or harassed. I think you're going to harass me, therefore Steve needs to be, quarantined and isolated and then charged.
Yeah, no, it's completely crazy. And
It
in
is
fact,
crazy.
there was a judgment a little while back where the judge said that stating verifiable facts could constitute hate
Yeah,
speech. I mean,
yeah.
can you believe it? I mean, you're saying you're making a statement of fact, and somehow it gets contrived as hate speech. I mean, so that's why I'm totally against those, you know, Bill C-36 and other attempts
Yeah.
that have been brought forward. Like, I think the criminal law right now is pretty simple. If you incite violence against others, that's a criminal act. And I think, well, I know very few people who would disagree that that needs to be in the criminal code.
I like something you're raising here, which is the fact that this law exists already, and adding another law or laws that form a kind of Venn diagram around these behaviors or these actions or these thoughts, Steve, allows for a scenario where any number of these things can or cannot be applied. This might be applied or that might be applied, and it turns into, I think, a very arbitrary, or an environment where these laws are applied arbitrarily. So if a person is not happy that the current law, as written in the criminal code, is not applied strongly enough or broadly enough or frequently enough, adding another law won't necessarily make the enforcement better or more frequent or stronger. It just allows for a scenario where these laws are arbitrarily applied in various contexts. It's a strange situation. That's what we have in Ontario right now with the quarantine laws, the health orders are changing every week, and it's so arbitrary. I don't want to change the subject though. Back to our conversation. Back to our question.
Can I press you, Jacques, just a little bit on? So you said, if I heard you right, it's somewhat self-evident that inciting violence ought to be a prosecutable crime. My concern is how do you define what kind of speech or even action to some extent incites violence in others?
Well, if you come out and you urge people to go and insert whatever race you want here and beat them up, wouldn't that be straightforward enough?
I guess, yeah. I just wonder if that's a real slippery slope. We had our January 6th, issued here in the U.S. with the insurrection or whatever description you want to give it, and a lot of people said that President Trump incited violence by what he said, and there wasn't any overt element of you and you go across the street and beat up so and so. It was just speech, though, that a lot of people had the opinion that encouraged people to take violent action, and that's where I don't know how you determine what one person, like what control does one person have over another, even if they're to that extent almost encouraging them or inviting them to go and do violence. I don't know, maybe that's splitting hairs, but
No, Steve, I have sympathy for your position, and I would say I'm in agreement that it is very, very, it has to be treated carefully. And, to the example that you gave, I'm no jurist, but I didn't understand how it could possibly pass, the test of being hate speech. So, if I had been the presiding judge on that one, I would have said, no, he was not inciting violence. Like, to me, it has to be, it has to be pretty clear, right? It has to be almost like an order or, like, I mean, Yeah. So I think we're in agreement, and we'll
Yeah.
have to see how.
There's an example I'd like to bring up that happened, I think, yesterday or today. Justin Trudeau on his campaign trail was talking to a group here in Ontario, very clearly describing people who are not yet vaccinated as them, as the others. We are in favor of vaccination, but the others are blah, blah, blah. And then he went on further to describe how those others are putting his children at risk, putting all of our children at risk. And I found that really strange because he was telling this crowd that there is a imminent threat to the well-being of their children, and that imminent threat is identifiably them. And if I've ever heard a politician in this country speak hatred, it's that. That's the example. Now, I don't think that should be illegal for him to say. I think it's despicable and unbecoming of a Canadian politician. But I would defend his right to say it. I just hope that Canadians are astute enough to see it for what it is. It's anger, and it's hateful and divisive, and it may be inciting violence. Like he's calling upon these parents to, I don't know, take action against the others. I'm not sure what his goal was, other than collecting votes. But do you have a comment on that, Jacques? Did you see any of that?
Yeah, so I did see that. I think he stopped short of inciting violence. I think if he had said, if you had taken a step further and said, no, I encourage all of my supporters to deal with these people, and even if you use sort of language,
kind of vague language or something. Yeah.
Vague language, like if you
Like
said,
it's time for us to stand up against them. It's time for us to
and
take
we better
action.
And we better deal with them, severely or something like that. Then I think you've crossed the line, because all you need is a few unhinged supporters to say, "Oh, the Prime Minister is telling me to go and beat up these people." I mean, you could easily see that happen.
I think we're all in agreement here about the hate speech, and I've answered the question. Let me bring up the next question here, which is Canada should decriminalize the possession of illicit drugs for personal use. By the way, beside me here is not a cannabis plant, but it kind of looks that way, and it has the 5 leaves on it.
I strongly agree.
Do you have any limits on that? So opioids and heroin and so forth?
No, none. I think that the example of Portugal is the way to go. That's the way they've gone. The number of death from overdose is way down. The criminal activity related to drugs is way down. The number of people who no longer fear, again, for fear of being put in jail, to come out and say, I am a heroin user. These people actually seek out now medical help. Now, if somebody, were to point out a maybe different outcome in a different country, but the one that I've studied the best is Portugal, and it seems to me that it's been a great success.
Does Portugal then nationalize it? Like the way, like I remember conversations in Canada about decriminalizing the use of marijuana. And at that time, I actually just thought it would be decriminalized. But actually what they've then done is they've turned it into a government monopoly. What was Portugal's approach?
I don't know much beyond what I said in terms of the outcome and the fact that it was decriminalized. I don't even think, I'd have to double check. It's been a while since I read it. I don't even think it's necessarily legal. It's just that now they don't put you in jail for consuming them. And again, the great step forward that it's done is it allow people to seek help, because most of these, let's face it, most people who have a drug problem, it's often referred to as a sort of a medical one, right? Where they need help. They don't need to be put in jail. They need help.
There's a medical component for sure. Steve, you've been out of our country long enough to, you would be surprised to come back to Canada and see now, like, Trudeau not only decriminalized the use of marijuana, but like I said, turned it into a kind of monopoly that now government regulates it, just like in Saskatchewan with the Saskatchewan Liquor Board. And as a result, this has created literally hundreds, if not thousands, even in the City of London, thousands of cannabis retail outlets. So not only did it become decriminalized, but it is now emphasized in storefronts everywhere you go. It's a really strange intended consequence, I think, or was it unintended? Like, did anyone not think that it would turn into a massive retail industry if it became government regulated and taxed as such?
It is interesting to see the way that people in government think about these things, because now, leaving aside whether they think it's a good thing or not, the only, in fact, it's almost like an obsession. It's, well, if we regulate it and tax it, it will provide us with revenue. And that seems to be the extent of it.
Yeah. But
revenue for what? Shouldn't the idea be, we'll decriminalize drugs, that will save X dollars of law enforcement, health concerns. If Portugal's experience is anything to be, expected, you have less health costs, less law enforcement costs, less other social costs and everything that go into that. And so that equals less cost for government ultimately, and lots of interested parties, besides government. And so why do you need to add tax revenue at the same time that you're saving all of this cost socially?
Well, I think the answer is self-evident. I mean, what socialist government doesn't want to just increase taxes for the sake of increasing taxes? And that's what has happened here. They've regulated this industry and they've enjoyed the tax revenue from it. I'm worried that then if this government, if our previous government becomes our next government and then decriminalizes everything, which is on their platform, decriminalize the use of heroin and so forth, would they nationalize that as well and regulate it? And would we suddenly have pop-up stores, retail outlets for heroin product? It's really strange, because that was the result of decriminalizing marijuana and regulating it.
Well, if the Liberals thought that this was going to bring tax revenues, I wouldn't put it past them to go that route.
Okay, so we've answered this question.
I just want to say, Steve has got an excellent point again in terms of, like, we've estimated that at the federal level, if, and I think that might have been for marijuana alone, there was a saving of $200 million a year in terms of law enforcement. So Steve is right. I mean, you would expect your costs to go down. And why would you want to raise more? Well, it's because a lot of the parties in this country, the government's never big enough. There's always more stuff you can add.
Yeah, Trudeau the other day was talking about how we've added 100,000 jobs. Maybe, but they're all government salaries. Like, they're all government jobs. He has expanded government by 100,000 staff. Very, very large government. Next question: how many immigrants should Canada admit? Many fewer, or many more, or somewhere in between? Who wants to tackle this?
I'm interested what what is the general libertarian stance on immigration? Does that something that needs to be throttled, controlled? Should be open borders?
So let me use a line from the standard politician. Steve, thank you very much for your question. Um, no, let me share again, our platform on immigration is that the government should be out of it completely. It should be privately sponsored, but with the private sponsorship comes with responsibilities. So if you are a company or an individual and you want to bring someone over, you are responsible for them fiscally for a number of years. If they commit a crime, you are responsible. So there's all kinds of caveat that we say, if we have a need, like if people can demonstrate that we need 400,000 people, which is, I think, pretty much where we run these days, then that would naturally flow. Again, with the responsibilities for the people who do this. In other words, the people would have an immense amount of skin in the game, which is the way it has to be done, not the way right now where you just pick an arbitrary number and you just hope that things kind of work out. But maybe it would come down to 100,000, or maybe it'd go up to 800,000. Who knows? But it would be for the market to decide.
Interesting. I've never heard someone articulate it like that, and it actually makes a boatload of sense.
So isn't there an unintended consequence there so you're saying that everyone that comes into the country ought to be sponsored by an individual or an enterprise that would then be responsible, like you say, for a number of years, both criminally and socially, so they can't fall back on social programs as long as they're under the sponsorship of that entity. What happens what about people that simply wish to move to Canada? Should there be a process without a sponsor to be able to qualify to show up and become a Canadian?
That's a good question.
I only ask it. I wonder if you're only talking about, because every time you say, well, leave it up to private enterprise, that's true, but I wonder if immigration, like national defense to some extent, needs to have some kind of national component. Otherwise, you get some real enterprising individual or company. You could see, let's move an entire country into Canada, or bring the entire population of some other country, and you could make that a fiscal argument for that. I think potentially.
Yeah, I mean, there might be. I mean, obviously, we need almost like a referee here to because it would be easy, say, for an individual. Well, let me give you an example that is somewhat related to what's going on in this country, where the leader of the NDP, I think part of their platform is massive cranking up of family reunification. Mm-hmm. Now, you've heard what I said earlier about our massive problem in terms of healthcare. It's sheer lunacy to me to bring in mom and dad who are now 75 or 80 and having contributed nothing to the healthcare bill in many ways are now going to start using resources. So let's assume, to your point, that people say, well, I'm going to bring my mom and dad, and yes, I got skin in the game. I'm going to, because in this case, it would be, well, if they come over and they need the health care, you're going to have to pay out of pocket. Well, I think somebody needs to, get involved and sort of underwrite this promise, right? I mean, how many funds do you have? I mean, they could end up with, open heart surgery, which costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. Are you good for it, right? I mean, I think we would need a mechanism where somebody would ascertain the extent of the promise being made.
It's an interesting conversation. I mean, to me, that's one thing that may reasonably belong in federal powers. That there may be a role for a federal government to arbitrate or be that referee to some extent to create the system whereby additional people come into the country. But but I don't think there's anything wrong with looking at some fiscal responsibility. I had to do that when I came to the United States. I had a relative of my wife who became essentially financially responsible for me for 10 years, I think it was. We were young and poor, and everybody else was getting on food stamps and all kinds of government help. And so we're like, let's apply for that. And we went and applied. And then my wife's aunt got a letter saying, hey, you you vouched for this guy, and now he's applying, and so you're going to have to pay for his food stamps or whatever. And so then we just withdrew our applications, but that mechanism was in place. So yeah.
I would just like to express that our immigration policies in Canada are backwards, in my view. My family employs a caregiver, and she's from out of country, and it is extremely difficult to, like, there's just a year's worth of paperwork and proving to the government of Canada that bringing her here will not burden the system in some way. It won't take a job away from a Canadian, that this person is needed. And I had to try and recruit a Canadian for the position, and of course I got 0 resumes from Canadians. Meanwhile, literally hundreds from people out of the country. She's here with us now for a little more than 2 years. She would be perfectly happy to now leave our family and go work for others or for another company, but she's limited by her current visa to one employer. She would contribute, she'd pay taxes, she works hard. This is the kind of person I think Canada should invite here and make the process easier, less cumbersome in some ways, and yet I think people in her situation compete for access to Canada against so many others that just literally walk across the border at Roxham Road and then are guaranteed a housing facility for 2 years by our government and guaranteed lifetime of health care and dental, which even Canadians aren't covered for dental services. It's just a lopsided incentive, lopsided benefit, lopsided focus, it seems to me. Thank you. I just wanted to vent about that for a moment. And we've sponsored her. Like like you said, Jacques, like we have skin in the game and have made sure that she that we're taking care of the financial need and her health care and all of that. Moving on. Oh, okay. How many immigrants should Canada... Oh, we didn't really answer. How many immigrants should Canada admit? Many fewer, somewhat fewer, about the same as now, somewhat more, many more, or don't know? What should we answer?
Well, I don't think under certainly our platform, the answer is we don't know.
Yeah. So the market would know. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
How much control should the federal government have over what Canadians say online? We've maybe covered a lot of this in the previous question.
I agree. I think we've beaten that horse to death here.
Yeah. So much less. Should Canada end its ties to the British monarchy? My opinion has changed in the past year on this point.
We don't have a position on this.
You're neutral?
Yep.
I didn't know that Canada still had significant ties to the monarchy post 1967. But And maybe that's a complete digression. You don't need to educate me on that right now, but
Well, this past year, Canada went through a very strange circumstance, where there was a period at which Canada did not have a head of state. The Governor General left her office, and so that chair was empty, and a Supreme Court judge was appointed temporarily to just kind of, do the day-to-day stuff, like the signing of documents, and so that the operation could at least carry on in the absence of a proper head of state. I actually reached this point where I thought Trudeau may take that opportunity to then become, in the next parliamentary session, to speak the throne speech himself. Essentially becoming the monarch.
He would love that.
I think he would, and he just couldn't figure out a way to choreograph that, or arrange it. We do now have a new Governor General, but I do think that the monarchy is the fact that we still have a head of state that is representative of the British monarch. That whole concept is under attack, and I've become of the opinion that the people who don't like the monarchy are the people I'm least trusting. That I trust them the least to redesign the parliamentary system without a monarch in it.
The devil that you know.
Yep, that's right. Let's bring the next question. How high should the federal minimum wage be?
0.
I'll say much lower. Okay, why 0? Well, how do you mean?
There should be no minimum wage law.
Yeah, absolutely agree. That's clearly something that doesn't make sense for government to try and meddle in, especially federally, especially for, municipally, provincially. I would still strongly disagree, but especially federally, minimum wage, $19 an hour, $15 an hour, whatever, in Alberta is not the same as it is in other places in the country. And it just doesn't make sense at all. It's so many unintended consequences with a minimum wage.
Agreed. Should we move on?
Yep.
All right. So, how much should the Canadian government do to make amends for its past treatment of Indigenous peoples?
Well, the question, as asked, doesn't make any sense to me. I don't understand how you can undo what was done in the past. We can only, if the question had been something like, what should the Canadian government do to, how should the Canadian government treat Indigenous people going forward? Then, of course, you wouldn't have this ranking of more or less whatever, but that is the question to ask. We cannot undo what people who came before us did.
I think this question is getting to the point of reparations. Like, the presupposition of this question is that there is a tax that can be paid to rectify and repair what was done.
Well, again, if I look at our platform, it's going forward. And by the way, I mean, it's fairly long, so I cannot summarize it here, but somebody who's close to the party who's Indigenous said that our platform, when it comes to Indigenous people, is far, far better than what they found in the Liberals, the Conservatives. I mean, they said the only good ones were ours and the PPCs, for what it's worth. I mean, one of the things that we do advocate is the federal government has been stalling, dragging its feet on land claims for decades, and they often do this because they have, in many ways, unlimited resources, since they have no skin in the game. They simply go into the taxpayer's pocket to finance these court battles, and often they do this in the hope that the claimant will run out of money. It's an old trick, and they do that. And of course, we would stop this immediately, right? I mean, what we would give the negotiators is, get this done, and get this done quickly. Enough of the dragging of feet, right? We also advocate for a almost province-like level of seniority to different bands, so they would have a lot more control over what they do. I mean, this is unheard of. So again, there's not much that I would be able to do about what's happened in the past, but going forward, I would treat the Indigenous people fairly, which is not something they're getting right now. People moan about what's happened in the past, but when you ask them, well, what are you doing today, right? It's nothing to be proud of.
Jacques, can I ask, because maybe you know this answer and I don't, but I think it's true that reserve lands are still federally controlled, and residents of reserve lands are not allowed to purchase property within the reserve. Like, is that true?
That is, for the vast majority of them, my understanding is that there is no such thing as private property rights.
Which to me is, like, Canadians must come to terms with the fact that we have communes where our government controls the means and property of massive land areas, host to millions of those residents, and those residents don't even have property rights.
Yep.
They can't buy a plot of land and put a house on it and care for it, and that didn't occur to me until I was 46 years old. I think that's a terrible injustice, and that isn't about the past. That, like you said, that's about what can we do now and going forward to enable property rights, or to enable a new kind of relationship. Interesting. So that question is, how much should Canadian governments do to make amends for its past treatments of Indigenous peoples? Let me bring that on screen again, because I think when I read this first, I think I was imagining reparations and payments and so forth, but maybe it's actually talking about action. What can Canadian government do?
Well, if we're talking...
they are talking about amends. So they're not talking about what could Canadian government do to improve the futures of, the future potential of those peoples. They're talking about amends.
Again, my view on this is that it's a waste of time to try. Like, we live in a world of scarce resource, which includes time and people. Mm-hmm. How about we assign resources to work on this going forward?
Mm-hmm.
Like,
so how about we don't know? Can I answer a don't know?
Yeah, that's fine.
And I cut you off there, but how much should Canada do to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions? Canada, how much should Canada do? Again, this is a nebulous discussion. Are they talking about Canadians? How much should Canadians do? Or how much should the government do? Anyway, read it however you want, but how should we answer this?
Well, this is a loaded question, because I think there are some hidden premises here. So let me cut in a way to the chase here, which is that the platform of our party is that all environmental issues, right? So again, going back to private property, if your private property is harmed by someone polluting it, the way to address this is not through the government, but is through the tort system. You take them to court. And there are all kinds of examples in the past of changes that have happened precisely back in the days. I mean, this is a very interesting part of history, because once upon a time, you could do that. And I'll give you two examples. Smokestacks came about because at the time the chimneys were very, very low. And women at the time were sick and tired of having their laundry that was being hung outside covered in soot. And they sued, and in order to stop having to pay big, damages or whatever, they, built huge smokestacks that took the soot away from people's clothing. Another one was trains would come by, and this was in the days where the wheels were not equipped with spark catchers. And they sent sparks, and because railways were often built very, very close to buildings and barns or whatever, they would set these people on fire, and of course they got sued. And it was like, well, we don't want to pay damages. What are we going to do? They, thought, okay, well, how do we do this? And they came up with the idea of spark catchers. Problem solved. Right? And again, all done through the court system. This was not government mandated. There wasn't any of this. And then something happened where, and unfortunately it's been probably a couple of decades since I read those examples, but something happened where the law, and those examples are American examples, something happened in the US where they decided that, I really wish I could remember, but they decided that was not the way to do it anymore. And suing to protect your private property was, I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's a lot less easy than it used to. So to the extent that someone says, okay, well, greenhouse, let's say CO2 to be more precise, increases the temperature of the planet, which in turn creates all of these, which is not true, but they'll say that it increases all kinds of extreme weather events, and therefore my house got blown out by a tornado. Okay, well then I'm going to sue people who consume CO2. Well, they would have to do it through the tort system.
I would say I'm not entirely convinced that the market could fix the environment, but I am 100% convinced that government will not fix the environment. And so if there's something to be fixed, which, I don't know that that's even a foregone conclusion, then I think I agree with Jacques. There's more chance. That's a pretty complicated class action to try and sue over CO2 emissions and get down to the level of what did that ultimately do to my house because of raised global temperatures or whatever. But I think there's more chance of that being successful than a bunch of national governments getting together and mandating something that's going to make a significant enough amount of change. I like Jordan Peterson makes a really interesting statement on the environment and this subject when he says the margin for error of what we can see, scientifically, as far as those temperatures changing 10, 20, 30 years in the future, the margin of error is wider than a lot of scientists believe the effect that we can, or the change that we can actually affect over that amount of time. So we might be able to say with some certainty that we moved it 2% or whatever, but then the margin of error is 3% or 4%. And so we can make an effort, but we will never be able to tell whether the effort had the effect that we intended or whether it was happenstance, circumstance, coincidence, or anything else. I think it's such a foolish
which makes
thing.
it a perfect wedge issue because the goal is so nebulous, and actions we take today can't actually be measurable, and it's a perfect boogeyman for political wedge, in my opinion. That's my fear. I kind of think like there are simple things we ought to all agree are good, like let's not put raw sewage into a freshwater lake. Let's maybe use petrochemicals for materials instead of fuel if we can. If we can find another fuel source, then like we know we need petrochemicals for plastics and materials and metals and like there are some useful decisions I think we could make together. But I think I agree with you that government has proven to not be very effective at fixing most anything, but including this issue of climate.
And the economic market may not work, but there's a social market too. You know, I mean, I think we've seen that a lot of people recycle. Most people don't throw trash on the sidewalk and pollute overtly. And I think that's a social change that's happened over a number of decades as well that will probably continue to evolve. But anyway,
I want to be aware of our time. Jacques, I know we're at question 10 of 30, and it's 10:19 p.m. So feel free to tell us, hey guys, it's getting late, and we can end here, and I'll just respect that. I just respect that. I didn't say disrespect that. Or we can move on. So what do you think?
I'm good for a while.
Okay.
Yeah,
so coming back to this question, how much should Canada do to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions? Don't know.
Well, I suspect they mean Canadian government, in which case I would say much less.
Much less.
Fair enough. I'd agree with that. No new oil pipelines should be built in Canada. Strongly disagree, strongly agree. What do you think?
Strongly
disagree.
I agree with both of you. The federal budget deficit should be reduced, even if it leads to fewer public services. I love this one.
Strongly agree. We have a fiscal a fiscal problem of massive proportion and needs to be addressed. We are essentially living beyond our means here, and it has to stop.
And I think this is like a boogeyman kind of question. Is there any real evidence that paying down a deficit, a government deficit, results in fewer public services? Like fewer services available to the public? Like clearly, if we reduce government spending, we're going to have to stop some of the services provided by government. But in absence of those services provided by government, it seems to me families come together with small businesses and offer those services in their absence.
Truer words have never been spoken.
What do you think, Jacques, about bigger government being the shortest path to smaller government? Because I agree very much with you that smaller government is the answer. I've had several conversations wherein, I don't know if we've crossed this threshold or we crossed it a long time ago. I mean, you could argue, I guess, different ways, but we are headed to a completely untenable economic situation. You talked about the 103% of budget being used for healthcare in the future. The only solution to that is massive borrowing and massive inflating of the money supply. and which has all of that consequence. And eventually, maybe we're not far away from our respective federal governments simply going insolvent. And if they did, people say, well, if the federal government goes insolvent, that's the end of it, right? That's we're in Mad Max time or whatever, and it's the apocalypse. But I don't know that it is. I mean, does that just force all of the decision making back down to a more local level, provinces and municipalities having to fight it out? And I mean, it's messy, certainly, but I mean, you know better than anyone the difficulty of getting the traction in the public with the message of we need to look at some of these systemic problems and start to address them in significant ways. And it doesn't seem like there's an audience for that. There's an audience for continuing to build this juggernaut. What do you think? Should we just let it happen and pick up the pieces after?
Well, let me repeat something. This was an answer to questions we were asked as part of our sort of debate leading to the vote for the leadership of the party. And I said to them, if you'd asked me 15 years ago about the future of libertarianism, my answer was at the time that we were in a race. And it was a race between being able to convince people that libertarianism was the right way to go and the entire economy imploding. And I said, I no longer believe that we're in a race because the economy imploding is definitely going to happen first. So I very much agree with you that the size of the governments, the debt, the unfunded liabilities are going to lead to a crisis that's going to compel us to start from scratch. Like it is going to be the great reset, but not the one that Justin Trudeau has in mind.
Yeah. I'm getting, as I go on, as I study, as I learn more, I'm getting less and less fearful of that eventuality. I mean, I don't know how far out down the road that is in reality, but I don't know that with cryptocurrencies, with technology, I think that we could, as a population, overcome that kind of a situation where the federal government, I mean, would have to shrink. It goes back to just sort of doing the few fundamental basic things that it was meant to do in the first place.
Well, I go back to my example of Estonia. I mean, they went from the government basically doing everything, and very poorly at that, to the government doing just a fraction of what they used to do, and the country is far, far better off.
Yeah. Yeah.
I could move us to the next question. Let's have a look. How much should be done to accommodate religious minorities in Canada?
By individuals or by the Canadian government?
Yeah. I think the premise is that the Canadian government may do more or less to accommodate religious minorities. Do we have an opinion about what that means? What does it mean to accommodate? Like, we already have freedom of religion in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and it was in the Bill of Rights before that, and so on. So what does this mean, to accommodate?
Well, David, I'm with you on this. We have freedom of religion, so I'm baffled by the question.
I worry that what it might mean is that we should have more separate schools for specific denominations. Would that be an accommodation? Does it mean that we should change our laws to allow sorry to say this, but should we allow female genital mutilation? Should we allow sex-selective abortion? Because those are part of religions around the world, supported by other countries, for example. Is that what this means, to accommodate?
You bring very good examples that it could be.
I think the question is being asked so that in future a liberal-leaning government can say, well, hey, our Canadians said we should accommodate religious minorities, and under that umbrella can be funding, set up special programs, change laws.
I think a really important part of
we do have a sitting member of parliament who tweeted, I don't know when exactly, but it's within Trudeau's prime ministership. She tweeted that Sharia fascinates me, she said. So is that an accommodation, that we would adjust Canadian law so that it's compatible with Sharia? That's a position that actually is taken by I believe is there a federal party, Jacques, the Muslim Party of Canada or the Islamic Party of Canada? I forget the name of that.
I'm not aware of any such thing.
I think it's really important to remember, in my opinion, the government's function is to guarantee the rights of individuals, not to guarantee the rights of classes of individuals or groups of individuals. Your rights are you have human rights because of the fact that you're human, not because of the fact that you are a human being and part of a particular group, whether that's racial lines, religious lines, political lines, sexual orientation, anything else. You have human rights, and that's on an individual basis. As soon as we start saying, well, we need to favor this group because they're a minority or a disenfranchised minority, the only disenfranchised minority that the government should seek to remedy is a disenfranchised individual, in my opinion.
Well, amen to what you said. I completely agree.
How about this then? For this question, how much should be done to accommodate religious minorities in Canada? It's my opinion that we should do much less. And by that I mean, what's written in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is that we have freedom of conscience and freedom to practice a religion. That's great. And that's all that's needed, is my opinion.
I agree.
Much less?
Much less.
How accessible should abortion services be across Canada?
More loaded questions. I think it should be as available as the market allows it to be, as available as the demand requires, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the federal government has a role in making sure that it's more readily accessible to everybody. Well,
okay, let me
talking myself into a corner quickly.
Jacques, does the party have a position on this?
Our platform states that the party itself does not have, within our ranks, we have pro-lifers, we have pro-choicers, coming from different. Essentially, I think what it boils down to is what status you want to give the unborn child, which then would say no, you can't have abortion, or other people say yes, you can. So a Libertarian Party would leave it to the MPs to vote according to their conscience.
I see. Yeah, okay, so let me put the question into some context, because I think I can add current discussion in Canada, in the Canadian political landscape, would be, for example, the Liberal platform says doctors should be required to perform the procedure despite their objections, their religion, their conscience, etc. On the other side of the spectrum, and I'm just talking about the sort of the extent to which current politicians are discussing the matter. Like some people are saying doctors should be forced to do the procedure and it should be widely available across Canada to all women. On the other side, I'm hearing politicians say, maybe we should have a conversation about sex-selective abortion. We should maybe have a conversation about late-stage, third trimester abortions. That seems to be the extent of our political discussion on this topic. So if we were to answer that abortion services should be much less accessible, that's this hand. I think what we're talking about is sex-selective abortion and late-stage third trimester abortion should be somewhat restricted. If we were to answer much more available across Canada, it would be the forcible, like an MD would lose their license if they refused to perform the procedure. That's what I'm hearing. Don't know? I don't know. Or about the same as now, and we should continue the conversation about this.
I think a literal understanding of the question would be that I don't think it's a problem currently. So
I see.
So then the question is, well, if it's not a problem currently, then the excellent points that you bring, should that mean that it should be less? And there, I provided you with my party's position. Again, if we were allowed to vote according to our conscience, which a libertarian government would, then I would certainly vote in favor of much less.
You as an individual, but your party, let's say your party, well, I'm sorry, I can't ask you to speak on behalf of others, but I'm just trying to figure out how to answer this particular survey question. I'm inclined to say about the same as now.
I think from a party point of view, that would be the answer.
Okay.
Proposition 15 of 30. How much should Indigenous peoples have, how much say should Indigenous peoples have over how Canada's natural resources are used? Another question again, totally taken out of context.
This is such a terribly worded question.
Yeah.
Because the answer from my perspective, first of all, in broad sense is, well, not any more than anybody else, right? Indigenous people, because of treaty rights and what have you, have special circumstances, but we can't start saying that they are, more important Canadians or better Canadians or whatever, right? I mean, they have the same say as all other Canadians. However, within treaty rights, and as I said, in terms of our platform, they would have a lot more say over the natural resources found on their treaty lands. Mm-hmm. So this, again, it's a simplistic.
This goes both ways too. Like there are, what was that project out in northern BC? The tech project in early 2020. I mean, the band offices had gotten together and negotiated with the tech, the company, and agreed that this pipeline should go through the lands, and they had agreed on revenue sharing and all sorts of things. And in that case, the indigenous peoples of that land wanted the pipeline and to make use of their natural resources. But I think the question being asked here is used sort of from an activist perspective, treating indigenous peoples as a collective that can be used as a lever in stopping projects that access Canada's natural resources.
Yeah. Okay.
So how should we answer?
Well, they ought to be able to block railways and what have you to get their point across. But the answer is clearly no.
Yeah. So much less. The thing is, all of us are hedging our answers because we know what is between the words here. We're reading between these lines, and we know how this would get used in a political discussion.
Yep.
Maybe go back to Steve's point, which is the question presumes that there is a collective that are all like-minded. And a collective should have much less control. No collective should have so much control. So maybe we answer much less here.
I would support that.
Notwithstanding the idea of everything you've explained, that they should be able to get their day in court and
Yes.
move towards resolution on some of these long-standing issues and contentions. Yeah.
Oh my, here's the next one. So Canada's human rights laws should require that transgender people be referred to by their stated gender pronouns. How do we feel on this point? How do we even respond to this honestly without being cast by an angry mob as any number of terrible labels?
You explain your position, and I mean, you strongly disagree with that. I mean, go back to one of my favorite Canadians, Jordan, and he's expressed that in 1,000 different ways, and I think really expertly. You can't compel speech. You're crossing into so many uncharted waters when you start to say, you have a right, you've got freedom of religion, you've got freedom of conscience, but we compel you to communicate this way. That's just bad territory to delve into.
Yeah, and I totally agree. But let me add one comment, and I think he actually brought that up. But he was referring to someone who was trying to be accommodating, but he had to keep on his phone because I think he was talking about up to 12 or 13 different pronouns that could, and of course he was dealing with a lot of people, and he needed to have this on his phone so that he could remember who was what and how they, right? So at some point these demands exceed the capacity of people of dealing with it on a day-to-day basis, and at that point it becomes completely unreasonable. In addition to the reasons that you've explained already.
I mean,
it's my feeling that okay, so I'm a corporate trainer. I offer training courses for tech teams and managers and such, and I've had thousands of people through my classroom of all kinds, and I've respected the names and and pronouns given to me. Admittedly, these have been the standard pronouns, he, she, and so forth. So I've not encountered some of the invented pronouns. I don't know how I would handle that. It would be difficult to, on the spot, just change my speech. I've had 46 years of experience with these pronouns, and to suddenly inject new words into my vocabulary, of course, every person would have to get used to that. But I actually think it's between people. It's between individuals. So here's I am, and there's a person in my classroom, and I want to be respectful to them and interact in a respectful way, and I would be happy to do so. I think this is not at all a place where government needs to intervene.
Yeah.
So, so I think we disagree with this, strongly disagree, right?
Right.
Okay. How much of a role should the private sector have in health care? Well, we already kind of talked about that. Could someone just, given our previous conversation, how should we answer this?
The whole role.
Yeah, so as in much more.
Yeah.
Yeah. How much money should the federal government give to Canadians whose employment was disrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic?
Again, very poorly asked questions, because they take it for granted that we should have had lockdowns,
Right.
which affected the employment. There's you get a chance to read it. There's a gentleman by the name of Douglas Allen at SFU, Simon Fraser University, which just completed a review of 80 different studies that have been done on COVID and its impacts. And the outcome is clear. The damage done by the lockdowns has far exceeded the benefits. And again, I'm not denying that there were some benefits. I mean, certainly some people did not die who probably would have died without lockdowns. But then it's this one-sided way that people have of making decisions that's completely wrong. You have to look, holistically, look at the whole picture. And there have been many, many more deaths as a result of the quite often unintended consequences. So this question, again, under a libertarian government, and I'm not saying that in March of 2020, we would have acted differently, but by April of 2020, it was very, very clear that this virus was not deadly for the vast, vast majority of the people, and we would have had no lockdowns. No lockdowns, no loss of employment. No loss of employment, the government doesn't get involved in terms of printing money and handing it out. So,
Here.
It's very difficult to answer that question the way it's asked, because it presupposes that the lockdowns were necessary when in fact they were not.
I will offer that the question as asked, if we answer it much less, okay, then I think public perception would rapidly change about lockdowns. So one of the reasons that people have felt comfortable to perpetuate the emergency orders and the lockdowns is because there is this promise of the CERB. But if the CERB just never happened, well, people would have fought to get back to work. That's my opinion.
Oh, no, I think you're right.
And therefore, the lockdown concept would have been short-lived, and the unintended consequences and deaths and harms as a result of the lockdowns would not have happened. I'm going to answer much less. 3, 2, going, gone.
Yes.
Should
David, should we reach a stopping point here?
Yeah. If both of you feel that we've kind of exhausted this, and I'm just enjoying it, and I don't get to talk much with two such interesting people.
Yeah, I'd really enjoy having Jacques on again uh, maybe post-election and just kind of see what the experience is and and have some more philosophical conversation around some of these subjects. I enjoyed a lot.
Hmm. So,
Yeah,
Steve, I'm hearing you propose that we call it a night and adjourn and
Yeah,
say our
maybe give
goodbyes.
Jacques
Yeah.
an opportunity to share some closing thoughts and yeah, say goodnight.
well, let me bring up one thing because, and again, I appreciate the opportunity, but let me, as an actuary, I actually have a degree in actuarial science. So, I do think that, I mean, heavy dose of math and stats and all kinds of nice things. And I think it does qualify me as a scientist. And I want to make a point um, about people who talk about listen to the science, and
Mm.
this is something where incidentally that type of comment is often made by people who don't have a science degree because clearly they don't understand what science is. And here I want to talk about science is foremost about the scientific method, and the scientific method in terms of theory is very, very simple. Through anecdotal evidence or observation, one comes up with a hypothesis and then you go and test it. Now, if the outcome of your test does not invalidate your hypothesis, you have not proven the hypothesis. This is something that I wish people would understand. Within all the fields of science, there is only one where you can actually prove something, and that's mathematics. Because in mathematics, if you can prove a theorem today, it's guaranteed that the theorem will still be true 2,000 years from now or 10,000 years from now, just like it would have been true 6,000 years ago if someone had proven it back then. But the rest of science doesn't work this way. When your experiment sort of confirms your hypothesis, the only thing that it does is it allows you to continue to use your hypothesis until it's disproven. So when people say, listen to the science, they completely misunderstand. I mean, over the last 18 months, how many reversals, and I'm not blaming people for the reversals if new evidence comes to pass, but they always make it sound like the latest evidence proves something,
Hmm.
right? So this complete lack of humility and understanding of the way science works. I mean, certainly in Canada, Tam, our senior health guru or whatever, I mean, she said, don't wear masks, they don't work. And then within a few months, it's like, wear a mask and wear triple mask if you can, because, they work. I mean, and every time they make a pronouncement, they make it sound like this is it. Like we finally got the truth.
Hmm.
And, I think this has contributed an awful lot to, I mean, there's a lot of people now completely disabused by what they hear from the so-called, you know, described elites, and which is why, again, certainly as a libertarian, we believe in giving people the freedom to experiment with different solutions. When people tell me, for example, that the public education system in Ontario is world class, my answer is always, how do you know? How can you possibly know unless you put it in competition with others? I mean, this is the way it works. I mean, we determine that people so and so is the best, or that thing is the best. Well, why? Because we get to compare against other lesser alternatives. But here it's no, it's a one size fit all, and we know the truth, and I think it's contributed hugely to a very, very bad discourse that's going on right now. Anyway, I'll leave it at that because I should move on here.
No,
Well,
I
no,
think
thank you for adding that, Jacques.
yeah.
Steve and I have had a number of conversations over the past number of months with about COVID and government's response to it, and yeah, everything you've just said it echoes many of the sentiments we've raised in the past.
Government does not seem to be a great practitioner of the scientific method. Namely, if something doesn't work, we don't do it anymore. It doesn't seem to be the prevailing thought in those circles. But well, it's been a real pleasure chatting with you, getting to know you a little bit, Jacques. And yeah, I'd certainly like to chat with you in the future.
Well, it's been great. I've really enjoyed it.
So, Jacques, what's going to happen next here is I'm going to take you off of screen, and we won't see you, but you'll still hear us, and actually we will still hear you unless you mute or leave the meeting. So feel free to stick around if you wish, or leave. It's been so great to talk with you. We live near each other, so I'd be happy to get together with you for a beer or a burger or a coffee. So let's please stay in touch. And Steve and I are going to just wrap up a little bit, talk about and reflect on the conversation we've had with you, and then we're going to call it a night. Jacques, thanks very much.
Thank you, Jacques.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care. All right. Thanks, Steve. It's been a while since you and I have had a chance to get together and talk. It's nice to do that again. So
yep.
I've enjoyed the conversation with Jacques. I'm so new to the term libertarian, and find that increasingly I find that I align with the simplicity in the platform, the simplicity in the position.
You know, I'm doing everything I can, social media and in my discussions to distance myself, to get away from the idea that there are Republicans and Democrats, there are conservatives and liberals, and never the twain shall meet. And yet, as I look at that, more and more, purely from a party leadership standpoint, I would say, not casting labels on anybody that happens to be members of those parties, but from the party leadership, what I see is Democrats saying we want much bigger government and we need it so that we can encourage or force everyone to live in accord with the ideals that we have. And the Republicans are saying exactly the same thing. Let's make government bigger so we can force people to do, what we want. And the Libertarians are the party that I hear saying, no. We have to give up on the idea that we need to convince other people to live the way that we choose to live, because it's everybody's choice to live how they want to, and let's shrink the government, leave more resources on the table in the private sector to let people pursue life the way that they see fit within a reasonable boundary, and the reasonable boundary is the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada. It's the Constitution here in the U.S. And I mean, we have laws. It won't descend into anarchy, if we shrink the size of government. So anyway.
Yeah, I've been saying to people that I will vote the rest of my life for smaller government. I've been saying to the representatives in my riding, and I've met a few of them now and made a point of saying to them that I want to know what your party will do to make government smaller and strengthen our charter. Because currently the trajectory in Canada is to, shred the charter and ignore it entirely, and make government as big as possible. And I don't like the direction that that's going. I just, again, really liked hearing from Jacques his perspective on some of these issues.
Yeah. Well, it's been a pleasure, David.
Yeah.
As always.
So I'll check these recordings. I'll upload them to YouTube and to Rumble, and I'll post them in our locals.com account. For those of you still awake and watching, of course, you can find us at fundamentalfreedoms.org. There are some essays there as well that Steve, and now I have one up there too. I have to catch up to Steve. He's got more essays up there than I. And I guess good night. Steve, I hope you're well and the family's doing great. And I wish I were there, actually, because Utah would be, it would feel like a free country compared to Ontario. We've got vaccine passports in virtually every province now. We're still locked down to some degree. You know, there are still restrictions on outdoor gatherings and the size of parties and masks indoors and still all that nonsense. So I wish I were there with you.
Yep, it's been interesting, that's for sure. Well, have a great evening, and thank you to those who are tuned in or will tune in later, and please make contact with us and continue the conversation online.
Thank you. Good night.